The sky had long carried whispers that the coming eclipse would not pass quietly. The elders, with their cracked voices and tired eyes, spoke of an ancient prophecy, that when the sun and moon embraced in darkness, a chosen one would rise to either shield the village from ruin or bring destruction upon it. The words had been repeated so many times that they slipped into the rhythm of everyday life like a lullaby no one believed would come true. Yet when the omens began, even the most hardened doubters felt a tightening in their chests. The girl had always been different. From the day of her birth, shadows clung to her in unnatural ways. At night, the moonlight seemed to follow her, tracing her figure even when clouds smothered the sky. The village had watched her grow with unease, whispering that her steps left echoes too heavy for a child, that her laughter stirred winds where none should blow. Her mother, long gone to an early grave, could no longer defend her. Her father, weary and afraid of the villagers' glares, often looked away, pretending not to notice the cruel things whispered about his daughter. When the nights grew longer and the sky began to take on an eerie hue, the whispers turned sharper. Children ran past her home chanting rhymes that branded her cursed. Women muttered at wells, warning each other not to let their children near her. The men, more fearful than they cared to admit, spoke in low voices about how dangerous it would be to let the eclipse arrive with her still walking among them. Fear made cruelty easy, and cruelty made fear spread faster than fire. Strange signs began to multiply. Animals avoided her path, their eyes rolling with quiet panic whenever she drew near. Once, a flock of birds circling the village suddenly dove low and scattered the moment she lifted her gaze. Another time, during a gathering, she touched a clay pot and it cracked down the middle as though unable to bear her touch. None of these signs hurt anyone, but in a village already steeped in superstition, they were proof enough. They said the prophecy was no longer just words, it had a face and it was hers. Her stepmother, always resentful of her presence, seized upon the growing fear. She would whisper to neighbors in the market, her voice oozing with feigned concern but dripping with venom. "Do you not see? She carries the mark of the eclipse. The spirits are warning us. If we let her live, she will bring doom upon us all." These words spread faster than truth ever could, taking root in hearts already ripe for fear. Soon, the girl could not step outside without feeling the sting of eyes that watched her like she was not a person, but a storm waiting to strike. And yet, in her innocence, she did not fight their scorn. She cried quietly, her tears falling in places where the earth seemed to drink them differently, leaving dark spots that lingered longer than ordinary tears should. The few kind souls who still pitied her grew silent, for pity had become dangerous. To be seen showing her kindness was to invite suspicion that you too shared in her curse. And so she became utterly alone, a solitary figure in a village wrapped in fear. As the days ticked toward the eclipse, the air grew heavier. Even the sky seemed dimmer, the clouds dragging themselves like tired creatures across a sun that no longer burned as brightly. The elders began to gather at night, their torches flickering as they debated in anxious circles. They pored over the prophecy, their wrinkled hands shaking as they recalled each word passed down through generations. Some argued that perhaps she was meant to save them, that killing her might only seal their doom. But louder voices rose, demanding that she be stopped before the eclipse. To them her survival was too great a risk. The girl felt the weight of their hatred pressing down upon her. At night, she would look at the moon half-hidden and strange, and wonder why the heavens had chosen her for such a fate. She did not ask for signs, did not ask for shadows or whispers. All she wanted was to be seen as human, not as a vessel of dread. But the village had already decided that her existence was tied to the prophecy. And when fear decides, truth no longer matters. The eclipse was coming. The drums of unease beat in every heart. And the girl, marked by omens she never understood, became the center of a storm she could not escape. The prophecy that could save or doom them was no longer just a story, it was her life, and it was about to unravel beneath the shadow of the moon. The house that once gave her shelter became the first stage of betrayal. Her stepmother, who had long filled the air with venom against her, finally moved from whispers to action. She did not act alone. Her father, worn down by fear and the pressure of the village, allowed himself to be pulled into the plot. Her stepbrother and stepsister, once companions in childhood, now looked at her as though she were nothing more than a threat to be erased. Fear had eaten away at whatever bonds they might have shared, and now their eyes carried only cold resolve. The decision was spoken of in hushed tones by the firelight. The girl, half asleep in her corner, did not hear all the words but she caught fragments. Before the eclipse, cannot risk, for the village, better one life than all. When she shifted on her mat, her stepmother's eyes snapped to her with a look that stripped her of humanity. In that gaze she saw what was coming. They had chosen. That night, hands she once trusted gripped her tightly. She was dragged from her corner before she could cry out, her mouth bound with a strip of cloth, her wrists tied with coarse rope that bit into her skin. She kicked and thrashed, but they were many, and her frail body was no match for their determination. Her father did not even meet her eyes as he held the rope steady. She searched his face, desperate for some flicker of love, of hesitation, but he gave her nothing. Perhaps guilt sat heavy in his chest, but if it did, he buried it beneath fear. The village slept as they moved her through the dark. The moon hung swollen, its pale light guiding them into the forest. The crickets sang and the trees swayed gently, as if nature itself watched the cruel procession. Her stepmother whispered constantly, her voice low but sharp as though speaking a prayer. "This is for us. This is for the village. The prophecy cannot be fulfilled if she is gone." Her stepbrother muttered in agreement, while her stepsister walked ahead, carrying a lantern whose flame wavered with every gust of wind. The girl stumbled often, her bare feet cut by stones and roots, but every time she fell they yanked her up again. The ropes tore at her skin until her wrists were raw. Her tears streaked her cheeks, soaking into the gag, but they went unnoticed. The cruelty was quiet, deliberate, the kind that pretended to be necessity. It was not rage that drove them now, but fear wearing the mask of duty. That made it all the colder. At last, they reached a clearing deep within the forest where the moonlight pooled like silver water. Here the trees closed in, their branches heavy and dark. It was a place no villager entered at night, a place whispered to be watched by spirits. But they had chosen it for that very reason. They wanted her gone in silence, far from the eyes of the village, far from the chance that someone might intervene. They forced her to her knees at the center of the clearing. The lantern cast their faces in uneven light, flickering between shadow and fire. Her stepmother leaned close, her breath hot and bitter as she hissed, "Do not curse us with your silence. Know that this is mercy. Better you than all of us." The girl's heart pounded against her ribs, each beat a scream that her mouth could not give voice to. She shook her head violently, trying to plead, trying to remind them that she was flesh and blood, not a curse wrapped in prophecy. But the ropes held her, and their fear deafened them to her silent cries. Her father's hand trembled as he gripped the knife. For a moment, it seemed he would falter, that his love for his daughter might crack through the fog of fear. His eyes flickered toward her, softening just enough for her to see the man who once carried her on his shoulders. But her stepmother's hiss cut through the night like a blade. "Do it. If you hesitate, we are all doomed." The knife did not fall, not yet, but its cold glint under the moonlight promised that the betrayal was complete. She was no longer their daughter, no longer their sister. She was a sacrifice they believed necessary. The forest seemed to hold its breath around them. The girl, bound and broken, felt the weight of her family's decision pressing down like stone. Their whispers of protection were lies dressed as love. What they truly sought was escape, from fear, from prophecy, from her. And in that moment, surrounded by shadows and betrayal, she understood with piercing clarity, it was not the eclipse that had doomed her. It was the people who were meant to love her. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The girl lay sprawled across the gnarled roots, her body trembling with each shallow gasp, her throat raw from the rope's cruel bite. Blood trickled from the shallow cut at her side, dark against her torn dress, and her tears streaked down to mix with the soil. The night should have moved steadily toward the long-dreaded eclipse, the moon sliding to blot out the sun in its ancient cycle. But above the treetops something impossible was happening. The pale disk of the moon, which had been gliding across the heavens with unbroken rhythm, suddenly slowed. Its silver face faltered, its glow thickened, and then, unnaturally, impossibly, it stopped. Suspended, as though some unseen hand gripped it firmly in place, it cast a cold light over the entire village and forest, painting every leaf, every hut, and every face in stark brilliance. In the village square, where the drums of celebration had been prepared to mark the eclipse's arrival, the people noticed first with confusion and then dread. The elders lifted their wrinkled faces to the sky, whispering frantic prayers, their lips trembling. Mothers pulled children close, hushing them though they too were shaking. The men who had gathered with torches, ready to perform rituals of protection, froze as if rooted to the earth. The eclipse had always been a moment of danger but also certainty. It came and passed like the beating of a heart. Yet now time itself seemed caught, suspended, refusing to carry them into the prophesied shadow. "The moon is stuck," a boy whispered, his voice carrying through the uneasy silence. "It waits." That word rippled through the crowd, infecting every villager with panic. Waits. For what? For whom? Those who had conspired to kill the girl shifted nervously. The stepmother, her hands still stained faintly from the struggle, glared at the heavens with a stubborn fury, as if she could command the celestial body to move. The stepbrother's fingers twitched at his side, his chest heaving as sweat dripped down his temples. The father looked sickly pale, his eyes darting toward the forest where they had abandoned the girl. He said nothing, but his silence was heavy, accusing, betraying his gnawing guilt. The animals of the village behaved no better. Goats bleated restlessly, tugging at their ropes. Dogs whined and pawed at the ground. Chickens flapped and scattered, wings beating frantically as if some predator prowled nearby. Even the cattle shifted uneasily, their great bodies swaying and snorting, eyes rolling white. A wind swept suddenly through the trees, cold and sharp, not like any ordinary night breeze. It carried with it the scent of wet earth, iron, and something else, something ancient. The villagers huddled closer together, their torches sputtering, their whispers growing louder, tumbling over each other with fear. One of the elders, his voice creaking like brittle wood, declared, "The prophecy has been angered. The chosen cannot be silenced. Until she breathes her revenge, the heavens will not move." The words struck like stones. The people stared at him, some shaking their heads in denial, others already trembling as though the truth had been flung into their bones. Mothers clutched their children tighter, men dropped their gazes, and even the stepmother's eyes flickered with momentary fear before she smothered it with her practiced scorn. But the sky would not be soothed. The stars seemed frozen as well, glinting like shards of glass. No cloud drifted, no insect chirped. It was as though the entire world was a held breath, suspended, suffocating. Then came the sound. Low at first, barely a whisper under the stillness, the faint, steady beat of something against the earth, like a drum buried beneath the soil. The villagers stilled, straining their ears. It grew louder, steadier, like the throb of a great heart hidden beneath the ground. They turned their eyes toward the forest, toward the place where shadows gathered deepest. And in that frozen light, with the moon stalled overhead and the eclipse refusing to fall, realization dawned heavy and terrible. The prophecy was not just a warning of doom or salvation. It was a pact written into the rhythm of the earth itself. Until the girl's fate was fulfilled, until her spirit rose or her vengeance burned, the moon would not move, the eclipse would not begin, and time itself would wait. The villagers, once proud in their certainty, now stood like trembling children under the weight of an unmoving sky. The earth seemed to hold its breath as the girl's body, once broken and fragile, began to stir against the soil. Her chest, rising shallowly moments before, now lifted with slow, deliberate breaths. The villagers who had come to witness her end stood frozen, their torches trembling in their hands. The wound across her side, still slick with blood, shimmered unnaturally. It was not the color of death they saw but the faintest glimmer of silver, threading itself through her flesh like veins of light. She groaned softly, and when her eyes fluttered open, a glow unlike anything earthly radiated from them, an argent fire that mirrored the stalled moon above. Her limbs no longer sagged with weakness. Instead, a strength surged through her bones, uncoiling like a serpent waking after long sleep. The villagers backed away, some stumbling as the girl rose to her knees, then to her feet. The air around her seemed heavier, charged with unseen force. Her hair, damp with sweat and dirt, caught the pale light of the half-hidden moon, and shadows gathered in its strands as if eager to serve her. The ground itself shivered faintly beneath her, and the villagers whispered in terror. Had death refused her, or had something greater claimed her? She raised a hand, and the motion alone drew silence. Her skin glowed where the wounds had been, pulsing softly as though the blood no longer obeyed mortal laws. Each cut shimmered with silver light, sealing yet remaining visible, scars transformed into runes of living power. The moon above, frozen in its attempt to consume the sun, seemed tethered to her heartbeat. With each breath she drew, the eclipse shifted slightly, yet refused to continue without her command. The villagers began to kneel, some in fear, others in reverence, unable to decide if they beheld a savior or an executioner. She looked at them, her gaze steady, and though her lips did not move, shadows around her began to whisper. The voices sounded like echoes of the dead, layered with the rustle of trees and the hiss of unseen waters. The villagers clutched at their ears, trembling, but none could flee. It was as though their feet were bound to the earth by the same force that held the moon in place. The girl's body swayed slightly as if straddling two worlds, the human and the divine. Her every step left an imprint of shimmering dust, fading into darkness only to reappear again, like moonlight settling on water. The forest itself seemed to bend toward her. Branches leaned as though bowing, leaves stilled their restless shaking, even the beasts of the night grew silent. From the deep blackness between the trees, eyes gleamed, watching with quiet submission. The girl extended her arms, and the air around her split between shadow and silver glow, the duality of the eclipse mirrored in her form. Her innocence had not left her, it was now sharpened, transformed into something untouchable, an innocence no cruelty could destroy. Her torment had become the seed of her ascension. A woman in the crowd, one who had spat at her when she was bound, screamed aloud, begging for forgiveness. But the girl did not answer. Instead, she closed her eyes, and the silver light along her wounds pulsed stronger, brighter, until it seemed the eclipse itself bowed lower in the sky. The villagers understood then that the girl was no longer one of them. She had been taken into the embrace of something ancient, something vast. Her body carried both wound and healing, light and dark, as if she had become the living embodiment of the balance they had once feared. The transformation was not only in her flesh but in her spirit. Her fear had vanished, burned away by betrayal and agony. What remained was resolve, carved into her as deeply as the marks of silver on her skin. When she finally spoke, her voice rang not like a girl's but like a chorus, layered, echoing, vast. It shook the air and rippled across the villagers' hearts. She did not curse them, nor did she bless them. She simply said, "The eclipse waits for me." The words bound them in silence. Some wept, others fell to the ground prostrate, while a few still clutched stubbornly at their pride. But none could deny that she was no longer prey. The girl they had tied, beaten, and abandoned was gone. In her place stood a being born of betrayal and starlight, carrying the patience of the moon and the wrath of shadow. The villagers, trembling, knew the prophecy was no longer a question of doom or salvation. It was a matter of what she would choose to do with her newfound power. She moved slowly through the forest path, her bare feet leaving faint impressions of silver dust on the earth. The trees bent slightly in her passing, their branches trembling as though touched by wind, though the air was still. Her breath was steady now, no longer ragged with suffering but resonant, like the rhythm of a drum echoing deep in the heart of the land. The girl's wounds, once raw and bleeding, now pulsed faintly with light, lines of silver that traced her arms and side like living scars. Her eyes glowed with a radiance not of fire but of moonlight, cold yet eternal. Every step she took seemed to pull the world with her, as if nature itself awaited her return. Behind her, the forest animals gathered in silence. Owls watched from the branches, their heads tilting as if in reverence. A fox padded quietly in her shadow, not daring to approach too closely but unwilling to leave her side. Even the insects, the restless hum of the night, grew still as though the world had agreed on one unspoken command: she must walk unchallenged. Above her, the sky remained dark, the sun half consumed, the moon suspended in an unnatural hesitation. It was not an eclipse anymore but a wound in the heavens, open and waiting. As she emerged from the treeline, the village came into view. Torches still burned around the gathering place where the people had dragged her hours ago. The crowd had not fully dispersed, too fearful to celebrate, too anxious to sleep. They had been watching the stalled eclipse, whispering among themselves, wondering what omen their cruelty had awakened. And then they saw her. A gasp rose like a single voice, spreading through the villagers as their bodies stiffened. Some staggered back, clutching at their throats as if the air itself had betrayed them. Others fell to their knees, muttering prayers in trembling voices. She did not rush. Her walk was deliberate, each footstep steady, her gaze fixed on the heart of the village. Children clutched their mothers' skirts and fathers backed away, eyes wide with terror. The glow from her wounds flickered brighter as she neared, and those closest to her swore they could feel heat in the air, though the night was cool. The ground beneath her feet seemed to vibrate faintly, as if the earth itself acknowledged her presence. Whispers rose among the crowd, frantic and breaking. She was dead. We left her for the beasts. No blood flows in her veins, it is moonlight now. She has returned for us. The elders, who had been the loudest voices demanding her sacrifice, pushed forward, their wrinkled hands shaking as they tried to mask fear with authority. One of them raised his staff as though the symbol of his rank could shield him. "Child," he called out, his voice uneven. "We did what we thought was right. The prophecy demanded a sacrifice. Do not blame us, blame the fate written in the stars." Her eyes shifted to him, calm but unblinking. She did not speak, and yet the silence itself seemed to answer. The elder faltered, the staff slipping from his hand to the dirt. He stepped back trembling. No words could justify the cruelty they had inflicted, and no defense could stand against the power walking steadily toward them. The villagers parted slowly, creating a path without being asked. They dared not stand in her way. She passed through them, and as she did, each person felt something stir in their chest, some a crushing weight of guilt, others a strange stirring of awe. Her presence was not rage alone, it was judgment. The glow of her body illuminated their faces, exposing fear, shame, and secret hatred. Some covered their eyes, unable to withstand her gaze. Others stared openly, spellbound by her radiance. At the center of the village, where the sacrificial fire still smoldered, she stopped. The ashes of the ropes that had bound her lay scattered near the pit. For a moment she simply stood there, staring down at the place where they had tied her, the place where they had believed her story would end. A strange stillness filled the air, so deep that even the crackle of the embers seemed hushed. And then above them the sky shifted faintly. The moon stirred but did not move forward. The eclipse remained frozen, waiting. The villagers tilted their heads upward, and realization dawned. The heavens themselves refused to continue without her command. It was not fate that held the sun and moon apart, it was her. The prophecy had not demanded her death, it had demanded her awakening. Her gaze swept over the people once more. She could see them as they were, every betrayal, every cruel word, every fearful whisper. And yet she did not strike. She did not raise her hand against them. Instead, she stood in silence, radiant, forcing them to look upon what they had done and what they had unleashed. The silence grew unbearable. A child began to weep, then another. Soon the sound of sobbing spread through the crowd like rain falling on dry earth. The girl closed her eyes briefly, and the light from her wounds pulsed brighter, casting long shadows across the ground. When she opened them again, she lifted her chin toward the sky. The villagers followed her gaze, breathless. The eclipse still held, but they knew, one way or another, it would not hold forever. It waited only for her choice. And so she remained there, alive and radiant in the heart of the village that had tried to erase her, her very presence a living question that hung over their souls. Would she bring ruin or would she bring mercy? The sky itself seemed to hold its breath, unwilling to move until she answered. The moment her glowing form reached the heart of the village, the sky answered. With a slow, thunderous inevitability, the moon slid forward again, devouring the sun's light until the world was plunged into complete darkness. A cold shiver ran across the land, and in that instant, every torch sputtered out, every ember died, and every flame was swallowed. The only illumination that remained was the silver radiance pouring from her wounds and eyes, making her look less like a girl and more like a figure sculpted from moonlight itself. The villagers gasped, their voices echoing into the silence, but no sound lingered, everything seemed absorbed into the suffocating night. The air grew heavy, dense, as though the village had been submerged beneath unseen waters. People clutched their throats, struggling to breathe. Dogs howled and tore at their chains, while goats and chickens scattered in frenzied terror. Even the trees that bordered the village creaked and swayed though no wind touched them, their branches groaning as if mourning. The river that once ran gently nearby stilled into glassy silence, its surface unmoving, reflecting only the faint silver glow of her body. She raised her eyes to the heavens, and the earth trembled in answer. A deep cracking sound split the silence as the ground beneath the huts began to fracture. Mud walls trembled, straw roofs collapsed in bursts of dust, and the proud village that once mocked her crumbled before her very presence. The villagers' screams rose, desperate and raw, but the eclipse muffled even their terror. It was as if the night itself swallowed sound, leaving their mouths gaping in horror without voices to match. Their fear became a silent play acted out in shadows and flailing arms. The elders tried to rally the people, their voices hoarse, but their staffs shattered like brittle twigs in their hands. The girl turned her gaze toward them, and the earth beneath their feet split, swallowing their huts whole. Families scattered, clinging to one another, tripping over the trembling soil as if the land itself sought to drag them under. The village square became a place of chaos, animals shrieking, children sobbing, and men who once stood proud now crawling on their knees, begging forgiveness into the empty night. From the forest came a roar not of a beast but of the land itself. Roots tore upward from the ground, thick and writhing like serpents, ripping through pathways and snapping fences. Some villagers tried to flee into the trees, but the branches bent low, catching at their clothes, tangling them like snares. The animals of the forest, wolves, owls, foxes, stood just beyond the tree line, their eyes glowing faintly, not moving forward, not retreating, watching with a chilling intelligence. It was as though all of nature had gathered to witness the reckoning. The girl raised her hand slowly and the sky shuddered. Clouds rushed in though no wind blew, and lightning forked silently, flashing silver streaks across the black canopy. Each bolt illuminated the destruction. Huts collapsing in waves, villagers stumbling into the rising cracks, the river's banks splitting apart. A chorus of screams rose, but again the eclipse muted them, making the terror sound hollow and distant. Only the pounding of hearts and the tearing of earth remained real. The cruelty of years past replayed in the villagers' minds as they tried to run. They remembered her tied to the post, mocked, beaten, forced to tears. They remembered the forest where they had dragged her, the hands that pressed her down, the whispers of betrayal from her own family. And now, as the sky darkened fully, they realized that the eclipse itself had waited, not for their prayers, not for their rituals, but for her. The darkness was hers to command. One man, braver or more desperate than the rest, charged toward her, clutching a rusted blade. His voice cracked as he shouted, though no sound carried. The girl turned her face to him, and before he could reach her, the ground beneath his feet split open. He flailed silently as he was pulled down into the earth, his weapon vanishing with him, the crack closing as though it had never been there. The others froze in horror, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The eclipse deepened, the last ring of light from the sun swallowed entirely. Darkness absolute covered the land. And in that suffocating black, her glow became the only beacon, a pale silver flame in a sea of void. She stood in the center of it all, her face calm, her body unmoving, while the village around her dissolved into ruin. The people's cries twisted into silent shadows, their figures collapsing beneath the weight of a night that did not belong to them. The rivers no longer flowed, they hung still as stone. The wind refused to move. Even the stars seemed to have fled the sky, leaving only her and the terrible balance of the eclipse. This was no longer a village. It was a stage for judgment, a place where cruelty met its end. And as the screams faded into silence, a truth settled over them all. They had tried to kill her before the eclipse, but the eclipse had been waiting only for her. Those who had bound her wrists, dragged her into the forest, and whispered of her death felt the weight of the eclipse before anyone else. As the darkness deepened, they stumbled, their bodies trembling as though unseen hands pressed upon their shoulders. Their voices rose in desperate cries, but the silence of the eclipse stole their words, leaving their mouths opening and closing like fish gasping in airless water. When they fell to their knees, their shadows writhed on the ground, twisting grotesquely, stretching long and thin until they curled back upon their owners like serpents ready to strike. The girl's glowing eyes fell upon them one by one, and in that gaze they saw themselves reflected, not as humans but as cruel beasts. Their faces and her eyes were swollen with malice, their hands dripping with the memory of betrayal, their laughter echoing though no sound filled the air. Some covered their faces, trying to escape their own reflection, but her light pierced their attempts, peeling back the illusions they clung to. They saw what they had become, what they had always been, and terror rooted them where they knelt. One man, the loudest among those who had plotted her death, crawled forward on his hands and knees, his forehead pressed into the soil. His mouth formed pleas, his arms spread wide in surrender, but her eyes remained fixed upon him, unblinking. A faint tremor rippled beneath him, and before he could rise, the earth yawned open with a low groan. His scream never escaped, the silence devoured it as the ground swallowed him whole. His body vanished in an instant, leaving only a faint ripple of dust above the crack that sealed behind him. Another, her stepmother, who had orchestrated much of the cruelty, staggered backward as if to run. But the eclipse spared no traitor. Her shadow pinned itself to the earth, stretching long and black like tar. She fought against it, pulling, tearing at her own feet, but the shadow clung like chains. The girl's silver glow grew brighter, and in its light, the stepmother's features twisted, warping until her own face blurred into a mask of ugliness, every wrinkle carved deep with hatred. She clawed at her face in horror, and then, as though the shadow could no longer contain her, she fell to the earth, sinking into its surface as though it had turned to water. Her final gesture was one of clawing desperation, her hand reaching upward, swallowed last. Others tried to scatter, their voices breaking into frantic prayers. Some begged the moon, others called on forgotten gods, but all their prayers returned empty. The girl's eyes followed them, her glow cutting through the dark like silver fire. Wherever her gaze touched, the guilty faltered. Some fell clutching their throats, their breath stolen as though the very air betrayed them. Others collapsed in agony, their limbs twisting unnaturally as though their bodies bore the weight of every lie, every cruelty, every betrayal they had committed. their faces contorted, eyes bulging, jaws open in terror until at last they lay still. A few dared to run toward her, perhaps thinking closeness meant safety. But when they reached the circle of her light, their knees buckled and their strength drained away. Their bodies crumbled into the earth like dry clay, scattering into dust that was carried by no wind, leaving nothing but faint marks upon the ground. Through it all she remained silent. Her lips never moved. Her voice was unnecessary. The moon spoke through her glow, through the eclipse that had waited for her, through the judgment that had begun and would not end until every thread of betrayal was cut. Her eyes, silver, endless, reflected nothing of mercy, only the balance of justice too long denied. The villagers who had not raised a hand against her trembled from the edges of the square, unsure whether the light would claim them too. They clutched one another, eyes wide, their breaths shallow. They whispered her name, calling her once innocent, once victim. Some bowed low, pressing their foreheads to the ground, unsure if reverence might save them. And in the silence, the guilty fell one by one until only the innocent remained, their faces pale, their hearts pounding with the weight of survival. The girl stood among the fallen, her glow softening slightly, but her gaze still unwavering. The eclipse above her had chosen its judgment, and it had been carried out. The first to feel the weight of the judgment were those who had bound her hands and dragged her into the forest. Their arrogance melted as quickly as their strength. One by one they staggered, clutching at their throats as if unseen cords tightened around their necks. The silence of the eclipse was heavy, broken only by their choking gasps. They tried to scream, but no sound carried. The moon had stolen their voices as surely as they had once stolen hers. Their faces twisted into grotesque masks of terror, veins swelling, eyes bulging as their bodies buckled under a force none of them could fight. The girl did not speak, for she did not need to. Her eyes, glowing with silver fire, passed over them like blades. In her gaze each one saw their true selves reflected, no longer the proud hunters of innocence but cowards, betrayers and liars. Their knees hit the dirt as their bodies convulsed, shadows writhing beneath them like serpents. When they looked up, seeking even a glimmer of mercy, all they found was the cold, steady light of the moon shining from her eyes. That light was unrelenting. It did not soften, did not waver. It held only the weight of justice long denied. Some tried to crawl away, desperate to flee. One man dug his hands into the earth, pulling himself forward as if the soil might save him, but the ground itself rejected him. It shuddered, cracked, and opened beneath his chest. He was swallowed whole, his body disappearing into a fissure that sealed itself moments later, leaving no trace of his existence. Another staggered backward, calling out for forgiveness, but his own shadow rose against him, binding his legs and pulling him down. He clawed at the dirt, leaving streaks of blood in the soil, but the shadow dragged him into the darkness, his last breath nothing more than a silent shiver in the air. The stepmother, who had whispered poison into the ears of the villagers and led the plot, tried to flee as well. Her hair flew wild, her arms thrashing, but the glow in the girl's eyes found her instantly. She froze mid-stride, her body trembling as though every bone remembered the lies it had spoken. The reflection in those glowing eyes showed her not as a cunning woman, but as a twisted creature, her face warped with greed and envy. She screamed and clawed at her own features, trying to tear away the vision, but the light did not release her. At last her legs gave out, and she collapsed into the dust, her form dissolving into ash that scattered across the earth without wind to carry it. One by one every conspirator fell. Some clawed at their chests as though their hearts had turned to stone. Others crumpled to the ground, eyes wide, their lips forming pleas that went unheard. A few reached out to her, thinking that if they touched her feet or begged at her knees, she might spare them. But her eyes never softened. The moonlight that radiated from her body was colder than fire, sharper than any blade. She was no longer the girl they had scorned. She was the vessel of judgment, and their fate had already been written. Those who had merely stood by, who had not joined the plot but had watched with silent approval, trembled in the shadows. They clung to one another, unsure whether her light would turn to them as well. Some wept, some bowed to the ground, whispering her name like a prayer. But her gaze swept past them, sparing them for now, as though the moon itself knew who had raised their hands in cruelty and who had only hidden theirs in fear. When the last of the guilty fell silent, the village square was littered with bodies and shadows that no longer belonged to anyone. The eclipse hung heavy above, the world still cloaked in that strange, eternal pause. She stood at the center, her face calm, her eyes glowing softly, the silver light fading only slightly. She did not gloat, did not smile, did not weep. She simply stood as the embodiment of justice fulfilled. The villagers who remained stared at her in awe and terror. They understood then that the eclipse had not waited for the sun or the moon, it had waited for her vengeance, for the balance of what was broken to be restored. The night the eclipse swallowed a village did not pass into silence, it grew into a legend. Whispers carried it first to neighboring clans, then to distant travelers, then to wandering griots who stitched the tale into songs. The story became more than memory, it became a warning carved into the rhythm of drums and the hush of firelit nights. They called her the Eclipse Girl, the one whose pain bent the heavens, the one whose vengeance made the moon itself pause in its eternal journey. Parents sat their children on their laps, their voices heavy with awe and fear as they recounted her story. She was just like you, they said, a girl who laughed, who worked, who dreamed. But when her own people turned against her, when they tried to spill her innocent blood, the heavens did not look away. The eclipse waited and the earth listened. Little ones would glance upward nervously whenever the moon turned dark, clutching their mother's arms, wondering if the sky still remembered her. Among the elders the tale took on sharper edges. They told it not as a ghost story, but as a lesson carved into the bones of the world. The eclipse, they said, was no ordinary shadow but a reminder that time itself holds justice. Do not raise your hand against the innocent, they warned. Do not twist truth into cruelty, for the moon keeps account. And when the sky grows dark, when the sun hides and the air chills, remember, an eclipse waits not for the strong but for the wronged. Some travelers dismissed it at first, claiming it was only myth, only fear dressing itself as story. But even the boldest learned caution when they stood under an eclipse. Farmers paused in their fields. Warriors lowered their weapons. Midwives whispered prayers as if the girl's spirit might be listening from the edge of the shadow. Her story was too vast to be dismissed, too heavy to be forgotten. The griots sang of her with voices that carried into markets and festivals. The girl who had been betrayed by kin, yet rose with the strength of the heavens behind her. They sang of how the earth split and swallowed those who tried to end her life, how the village that mocked her name was reduced to ruins, and how the moon lingered until her justice was complete. People clapped, danced, and shivered at the verses, each heart silently asking, would the eclipse remember me too if I wronged the innocent? Generations passed, but the eclipse girl remained more present than the graves of chiefs or the shrines of ancestors. Her name was etched into warnings scrawled on the walls of schools and whispered by lovers in the heat of quarrels. When a child cried unfairly, another would hush them with a sharp rebuke, be still or the eclipse will hear you. When a quarrel grew violent, an elder would part them with the reminder, do not make the moon a witness against you. And still eclipses came. Each time the land grew quiet. Chickens hushed, goats bleated and then stilled, markets froze mid-bargain. Eyes turned skyward, but no one saw, only shadow. They saw her. They saw the girl whose grief the heavens had carried, whose justice had rewritten the order of day and night. Some whispered prayers to her spirit. Others made offerings, poured water on the earth, left kola nuts at crossroads, or sang softly in hopes of appeasing the memory. The eclipse was no longer just a celestial event, it was a covenant of fear and reverence. But her story was not all darkness. Among the younger generations she was remembered as a figure of strength. Daughters, especially, listened to her tale and carried it like a flame inside them. They saw in her not only vengeance but defiance, the proof that even those dismissed, even those betrayed, could rise and change the very fabric of the world. If the eclipse girl could command the sky, they whispered to one another, then we too can shape our fate. Her legend crossed borders, carried by merchants and hunters who spoke of the girl whose people tried to kill her, but whose innocence bent the universe itself. In far-off lands she became a proverb, the moon waits for the innocent. It was said in trials when judgment was delayed, in disputes when the truth was hidden, in moments when cruelty seemed triumphant. The phrase reminded all that time might be long but justice was longer still. And so the eclipse girl lived on, not as bones in the earth, not as a shadow swallowed by time, but as a living warning. Her story echoed in lullabies, in chants, in the silence that always descended whenever the moon slid across the sun. She was the girl who could not be erased, because her pain had written itself into the sky. Even now, when an eclipse darkens the land, children clutch their mothers, warriors bow their heads, and elders speak softly of the past. They say the moon is watching, waiting, listening. They say the girl's eyes still glow in the silver rim of darkness, reflecting every unjust deed committed beneath the heavens. And they remind each other, again and again, never spill innocent blood, for the moon remembers, and the eclipses wait.